He said it slowly, deliberately, in English, which meant he had prepared it. Oberst Klaus Dietrich Voss, 53 years old, commander of a Wehrmacht infantry regiment that had operated in France and Belgium since 1940, had been in American custody for 6 days when he was brought into the room where George S. Patton was waiting for him. It was May 3, 1945. The war in Europe had 4 more days left in it, though nobody in that room knew that yet. Voss was not bound. His uniform was intact. He had the bearing of a man who had spent 30 years being obeyed, and he had not yet fully processed the information that those 30 years were over. He sat down across from Patton without being invited to. He looked at the American general with the particular expression of a man who has decided that the situation requires a position, and that his position requires stating. And then he said it. Clear, measured, without heat. "America," he said, "has no right to judge Germany." The room had 5 other people in it: a colonel, 2 captains, an aide, and a JAG officer who was there to document the proceeding. Every one of them went still. Patton looked at Voss for a moment. Then he picked up a single sheet of paper from the desk in front of him and placed it face down. He did not look away from Voss. His knuckles did not go white. His jaw did not clench. He was completely, entirely, terrifyingly calm. And then he began to talk. And what he said over the next 11 minutes is the reason this story exists. Subscribe. This channel exists to keep stories like this alive. Now, here's the thing about Klaus Voss. He wasn't stupid. That's the first thing you have to understand, because stupid men say stupid things for stupid reasons, and what Voss said wasn't stupid. It was a position, a carefully considered, philosophically prepared position that Voss had apparently been developing during 6 days in an American holding facility, while he watched the Third Army process prisoners and tried to understand what the next phase of his life was going to look like. He had decided that the next phase required a framework, and the framework he had chosen was equivalence. The argument, stripped down to its bones, was this: America had its own history of violence, its own record of things done to people who didn't deserve them, and therefore America occupied no moral altitude from which judgment of Germany was legitimate. It was, if you want to be clinical about it, a tu quoque argument. A whataboutism delivered in English by a man who had commanded a regiment in occupied France for 5 years. See, what most folks don't realize is that this argument was not invented by Voss. By the spring of 1945, it had become something close to a standard response among senior Wehrmacht officers facing American interrogation. It was in circulation. Officers had discussed it among themselves. Some version of it would appear, over the following 2 years, in the testimony of dozens of German officers at Nuremberg and in the subsidiary proceedings. The argument was seductive because it contained a grain of truth wrapped in a shell designed to neutralize that truth's opposite. Yes, America had its own history. Yes, there were things in that history that did not bear scrutiny. And Voss believed, genuinely believed, the way intelligent men sometimes believe things that serve their interests, that surfacing those things neutralized the authority of the men sitting across from him. He had miscalculated in one significant way. He was sitting across from Patton. Let me back up for a second, because the context for this encounter is what makes Patton's response carry the weight it carries. 3 days before Voss made his statement, Patton had personally walked through the Ohrdruf concentration camp. Ohrdruf was a subcamp of Buchenwald, located near the town of Gotha in Thuringia. Third Army had liberated it on April 4, 1945. It was the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by American forces. What Patton saw there, what Eisenhower saw there, what Bradley saw there when they all visited on April 12th, is documented in multiple accounts and in Patton's own diary, which he kept obsessively throughout the war. Patton vomited. He said so himself in writing, and Patton was not a man who admitted to that kind of reaction easily or often. He then ordered every American soldier in the area who was not on the front line to tour the camp. He then ordered the German civilians from the surrounding town to be brought through it. He wanted them to see. He was very specific about wanting them to see. That is the man Voss was talking to when he said America has no right to judge Germany. Picture it. The room, the table, the two men. Voss with his prepared argument and his 30 years of being obeyed. Patton with 3 days of ordre behind his eyes and 11 pages of documented crimes committed by Voss's regiment sitting face down on the desk between them. Here's where it gets ugly. Not for Patton, for Voss. Patton's response, as documented by the JAG officer present, a first lieutenant named Samuel Eckhart, 28 years old, from Philadelphia, who was taking notes in shorthand and later transcribed them, began not with an argument. It began with a question. Patton asked Voss if he had ever been to a place called Ohrdruf. Voss said he had not. Patton asked him if he knew what Ohrdruf was. Voss said he had heard things. Patton said he had been there. He said it the way you say something that you need someone to understand is not abstract. He said, "I was there 3 days ago." And then he described, in precise and clinical terms, 3 specific things he had seen. Not categories of horror. 3 specific things, with specific physical dimensions, in specific locations within the camp. Eckhart's transcript records that Patton's voice did not change register once during this description. He did not raise it. He did not lower it. He described what he had seen at the same conversational pitch he used to discuss logistics. Then he picked up the sheet of paper that had been lying face down on the desk and turned it over and placed it in front of Voss. The paper was a summary document, 2 pages. Actually, Eckhart notes that Patton underestimated by 1 page, covering documented actions of Voss's regiment in the Pas-de-Calais region of northern France between September and December of 1942. The summary had been prepared by 3rd Army's Counterintelligence Corps, based on documentation captured when Voss's regimental headquarters was taken intact on April 27, 1945. Voss's staff had not had time to burn the files. 3 filing cabinets fully intact, containing 31 months of regimental administrative records. The CIC team that went through them spent 4 days on the task and produced a 47-page summary of which Patton was holding the first 2 pages. The 47 pages covered a lot of ground, but the section that Patton had placed in front of Voss covered one specific incident, the processing of French civilian prisoners in the town of Hénin-Beaumont in October of 1942. Specifically, the processing of 41 French men between the ages of 17 and 62 who had been detained on suspicion of resistance activity, held in the local school building for 11 days, and then transferred to a processing facility from which 26 of them never emerged through any documented channel. Not executed, there was no execution order in the files. Not transferred, there was no transfer paperwork. They were in the school on day 11. They were not in any subsequent document. 26 men. Gone from the paperwork the way things go from paperwork when someone has decided that paperwork is the problem. I'm not making this up. Among the 41 detained men was a 19-year-old named Émile Renard, a baker's apprentice from Hénin-Beaumont, whose father had reported him missing to the town's records office on November 8, 1942. The father's report still existed. It had survived in the town's municipal archive, because civilians keep records in ways that occupying armies sometimes fail to anticipate. Émile had been detained on October 14th. He was not among the 15 who came out the other side of the processing facility. He was not among the dead who were eventually accounted for. He was among the 26. And his father had written his name on a piece of paper in a municipal records office in November of 1942, because that is what fathers do when their sons disappear, and that piece of paper had survived everything. Think about that for a second. Patton told Voss to look at the summary page. Eckhart's transcript notes that Voss looked at it. Patton then told him, according to Eckhart's transcript, that the page in front of him represented 2 pages out of 47, that the 47 pages represented the work of 4 days by 3 CIC officers, that the 3 filing cabinets those 4 days covered represented 31 months of one regiment's operations, and that the American forces had, across the entirety of the German occupation of Western Europe, recovered or were in the process of recovering documentation from hundreds of such regimental headquarters, divisional headquarters, and administrative facilities. He said that the word America, when Voss used it, referred to the men who had gone through those filing cabinets for 4 days. It referred to the men who were going through the other filing cabinets. It referred to the men buried in France and Belgium and Luxembourg who had paid the cost of getting to the filing cabinets. And it referred to the men and women in the camps, documented and not yet fully documented, who were the content of what was in the filing cabinets. He said, "Those are the people America represents in this room." Then he paused. Eckhart notes the pause. He says it lasted approximately 8 seconds, which in a room that quiet is a very long time. Then Patton said, "Now tell me again about America's right to judge." Dead serious. That is what he said. Documented. In Eckhart's shorthand transcript, transcribed the same afternoon, preserved in the 3rd Army JAG records. And this is where the story turns, because Voss did not respond. Not with an argument. Not with a restatement of his position. He looked at the summary page on the desk in front of him for approximately 30 seconds, according to Eckhart's account, and then he looked up and he said, in German, reverting to German for the first time since the encounter began, that he would answer questions. That is all he said. He did not retract his opening statement. He did not apologize for it. But he did not repeat it either. The position he had prepared and delivered, and apparently believed, would establish some kind of moral equilibrium in that room had simply stopped functioning. Not because Patton had out-argued him, because Patton had put the actual record on the table, and the actual record did not leave room for the position. Stay with me on this one, because what happened next is the part that most accounts of this encounter leave out. Voss answered questions for 3 hours. The interrogation that followed, conducted by a CIC captain named Leonard Howell, with Eckhart continuing to document, covered the Pas de Calais period in detail. Voss was cooperative. Precisely, methodically, carefully cooperative, in the way that intelligent men are cooperative when they have assessed the documentary record they are facing and concluded that the documentary record is not going to yield to denial. He confirmed the detentions at Hénin-Beaumont. He said the decisions regarding the 26 missing men had been made at a level above his command. He named the officer he said had given the relevant instruction. That officer, a General der Infanterie named Helmut Reck, had been killed on the Eastern Front in March of 1944. Convenient as these things go. But Voss named him, and naming him placed his own account of events, his version of the chain of command, into the formal record of the proceeding, where it could be tested against other evidence. Here's the part that didn't make it into the official report. The officer Voss named, Reck, had indeed commanded the military district covering the Pas de Calais in the fall of 1942. That was verifiable and was quickly verified. But the CIC team reviewing the filing cabinets had also found, in the 3rd cabinet, a routing document bearing Voss's own signature authorizing the transfer of the detained civilians from the school building to the processing facility. Not an order for what happened to them at the processing facility, just the transfer authorization. But the transfer authorization had Voss's signature on it. and a transfer authorization with his signature on it placed Voss directly in the administrative chain for what happened to those 26 men, regardless of what Rec had or hadn't ordered at a level above him. Howe found the routing document on day 2 of the CIC review. He had been waiting to see if Voss would mention it voluntarily. Voss did not mention it voluntarily. When Howe placed it on the table in front of him on hour 2 of the 3-hour interrogation, Voss looked at his own signature for a long time. Eckhart's notes described the pause as approximately 45 seconds. Then Voss said that the transfer was a standard administrative procedure and that he had no knowledge of what occurred at the processing facility after the transfer. Howe did not argue with him. He made a note. He placed the routing document in the evidence file, and he moved on to the next question. What's hard to swallow is that Voss was partially right about that. The routing document proved his administrative participation. It did not prove his personal knowledge of what happened afterward. That distinction mattered legally. It would matter again at the tribunal. But legally sufficient proof and moral reality are two different things, and the routing document existed because someone had to authorize the transfer, and Voss had authorized it, and 26 men had been transferred, and 26 men had not come out the other side. His signature was on the paper. The paper was in the evidence file. That is what accountability looks like when it is imperfect and insufficient, and still the only thing available. Fast forward to the tribunal. Not Nuremberg, that was for the senior leadership. Voss was tried before a military tribunal in the American occupation zone in July of 1946. The charge was complicity in crimes against civilian populations under the laws of armed occupation. The routing document was central evidence. The 47-page CIC summary was entered in full. The surviving municipal records from Hénin-Beaumont, including the father's missing persons report for Émile Renard, filed November 8, 1942, were entered as documentary evidence of the human cost of the administrative chain Voss had participated in. The father's name was Henri Renard. He was 61 years old at the time of the tribunal. He had been asked if he wished to submit a written statement. He had submitted 3 paragraphs. The tribunal stenographer recorded that those 3 paragraphs were read aloud in court, and that the room was quiet during the reading and for approximately 30 seconds afterward. I'll tell you what. Some silences say more than any argument can. The tribunal found Voss guilty, sentenced to 10 years. He served 6 at Landsberg. He was released in 1952. He died in Hamburg in 1967. His obituary in a local Hamburg newspaper described him as a retired military officer and noted his wartime service without further detail. That is what the end of this story looks like from the outside. A newspaper paragraph with no further detail. Here's what the end of it looks like from the inside. Eckhart's transcript of the May 3rd encounter, the one where Voss said America has no right to judge Germany, and Patton put 2 pages of a 47-page summary on the table and asked him to say it again. That transcript was preserved in the 3rd Army JAG records, which were transferred to the National Archives, where they remain. Eckhart himself, after the war, became a district attorney in Philadelphia. He served for 22 years. He never spoke publicly about the Voss encounter, as far as any record indicates, but he kept a copy of his own shorthand notes in a personal file that his family donated to a Philadelphia Historical Society in 1994. The original shorthand is there. In the margin of the page covering Patton's response, in Eckhart's own hand, is a single annotation added at an unknown later date. It reads, "I have never heard a man answer a question more completely." Sit with that. Now, here's what I want to bring you back to. Voss prepared his statement in English because he wanted it understood. He wanted it on the record. He wanted the American in the room to hear the argument clearly and to feel the weight of it. He had spent 6 days constructing the position he believed would create equilibrium in a room that had no equilibrium to offer him. And Patton listened to it. He didn't interrupt. He let the whole thing land, and then he turned over a piece of paper. 2 pages of a 47-page summary. That was the answer. Not a speech, not a counter-argument. The record. The actual, physical, documented, signed and dated record of what Voss's regiment had done, placed on a table in front of the man who had commanded it. 2 pages. And the thing Voss had spent 6 days building in his head stopped working. The routing document with Voss's signature is in the National Archives, in a box, with a reference number. 3 filing cabinets that his staff didn't have time to burn produced 47 pages that put his name in a chain that ended with 26 men who never came back from a processing facility in northern France, including a 19-year-old baker's apprentice named Émile Renard, whose father wrote his name on a piece of paper in a records office in November of 1942 and never got an answer that satisfied him. That piece of paper is also in an archive. In Hénin-Beaumont, the municipal archive survived the occupation and the liberation and the decades after, and Émile's name is in it, in his father's handwriting, and it has been there since November 8, 1942, which is longer than Voss's position lasted in that room on May 3, 1945. Subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to know.